January 1946, Nuremberg. A grey winter dawn settles over the ruins of a city that once echoed with rallies and parades. Now it is silent, broken only by the muffled footsteps of guards packing the stone corridors of the Palace of Justice. Inside, under the cold glow of ceiling lamps, a tall, gaunt man sits alone at a wooden table. His uniform is gone, the medals stripped. Only the severe angles of his face remain, the unmistakable scar running from his ear to his chin, the old dueling wound that became his signature. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, former chief of the Reich Security Main Office, the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial at Nuremberg. He leafs through documents that carry his name, orders, reports, affidavits. Each page seems to pull him backward, not to the courtroom awaiting him, but to the world he once commanded, the shadow network of prisons, interrogations, deportations, and secret directives that shaped the darkest machinery of the Third Reich. Beyond the walls, the rebuilt German dawn is beginning. Inside, the reckoning is only just starting. And to understand how this man reached this table, in this silent room, we must first return to the world that created him, to the years before his face became one of the most feared in Europe. To understand Ernst Kaltenbrunner, one must begin in the fractured political atmosphere of the interwar years, a period when borders, identities, and loyalties across Central Europe shifted with dangerous speed. Kaltenbrunner was born in 1903 in Ried im Innkreis, a sleepy Austrian town still carrying the scars of a collapsed empire. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy had vanished, leaving behind uncertainty, poverty, and a generation searching for direction. The young men who grew up in these drifting years often found stability not in democracy, but in movements promising order, destiny, and national rebirth. Kaltenbrunner was part of that generation. Law school in Linz sharpened his mind, but also fed his ideological leanings. As a law student and later as a practicing attorney, he moved in circles where nationalism, antisemitism, and resentment toward the post-war settlement mixed freely. His physical presence, towering, austere, scarred, helped him rise quickly among the Austrian Nazi ranks. By the early 1930s, he was no longer simply a sympathizer. He had become one of the movement's legal defenders, representing its members in court, shielding its operations behind technical language and procedural maneuvering. The Austrian state saw the Nazi underground as a threat. It banned the party, arrested activists, and struggled to hold the fragile republic together. But the crackdown only intensified the resolve of radicals who believed unification with Germany was inevitable. Among them, Kaltenbrunner became a coordinator, not yet a national figure, but one of many ambitious young operatives who built the party's shadow networks. Safe houses, message couriers, propaganda channels, and clandestine meetings across alpine towns and industrial valleys. Then came 1934. A failed Nazi-backed coup in Vienna left the Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss dead. The government responded with mass arrests, raids, and executions. For many Austrian Nazis, including Kaltenbrunner, the event became a turning point. He was detained that year, spending time in internment. The imprisonment was brief but symbolic. It branded him, in party circles, as a martyr of the movement, a man who had paid a personal price for the cause. When he was released, he returned to Nazi work with greater determination. The mid-1930s saw him positioning himself deeper inside the SS structure. In Austria, the SS remained technically illegal, but it operated with growing confidence. Kaltenbrunner's background as a lawyer made him valuable. He drafted memos, coordinated with German counterparts across the border, and earned a reputation for both loyalty and efficiency. He showed none of the flamboyance of other Nazi leaders. Instead, his rise was marked by cold discipline and an ability to navigate the blurred line between legality and subversion. By 1938, Europe trembled with the sense that old boundaries were about to vanish. Hitler's Germany exerted mounting pressure on Austria, demanding concessions, appointments, and reforms, all calculated steps toward annexation. Within Austria, the underground networks that Kaltenbrunner helped maintain were no longer operating in the shadows. They were placing their people in key administrative roles and aligning internal security forces with Berlin's designs. And then came March 12, 1938. German troops crossed the border. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into the Third Reich, unfolded with dizzying speed. Crowds gathered in Vienna, cheering, waving flags, welcoming what many believed was national unification fulfilled. Behind the spectacle, however, the new regime immediately moved to dismantle opposition and neutralize perceived enemies. Arrest lists had already been prepared. Targets were tracked, homes were raided, and political rivals were swept away as if a switch had been flipped. Kaltenbrunner stepped forward into this moment with precision. He was appointed State Secretary for Public Security in Vienna and soon after became the higher SS and police leader for Austria. Now he had the authority he had long operated without, the power to coordinate police, SS units, intelligence services, and newly seized institutions. The machinery he once protected from the shadows was now under his direct command. Under this new authority, the political climate in Austria darkened. Jewish communities faced immediate persecution, businesses seized, rights stripped, humiliations carried out in broad daylight. Political dissidents, labor leaders, and clergy found themselves interrogated, dismissed, or imprisoned. The absorption of Austria into the Reich was not merely political. It was administrative, methodical, and enforced by men like Kaltenbrunner, who ensured that no corner of Austrian society resisted the new order. Yet even in this moment of rapid ascension, his ambition was not satisfied. The Austrian SS had become fully integrated into Heinrich Himmler's empire. Vacancies, rivalries, and shifting responsibilities inside the Nazi hierarchy opened new possibilities for advancement. And among those possibilities, one path led toward the most powerful security institution in Nazi Germany, an institution about to lose its greatest architect. Because events soon to unfold in Prague would reshape the core of the Nazi security apparatus and pull Ernst Kaltenbrunner even deeper into the heart of the regime's darkest operations. The transformation of Nazi security policy in the early 1940s pivoted around a single event, the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich. As head of the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA Heydrich had built a system of intelligence, political policing, and racial persecution unmatched in scope. His death in June 1942, after an attack by Czech resistance fighters in Prague, left a vacuum at the center of one of the Reich's most feared institutions. Heinrich Himmler, already stretched thin managing the Waffen-SS, concentration camps, and the expanding war effort, hesitated to place a strong-willed or overly ambitious figure in Heydrich's position. He needed someone loyal, compliant, and ruthless, someone who understood the machinery but would never challenge Himmler's authority. Among the candidates, one stood out, the tall Austrian with a legal background, a proven record of obedience, and a growing influence in regional SS circles. In January 1943, Ernst Kaltenbrunner was appointed chief of the RSHA. The timing was critical. Germany's war fortunes were beginning to shift. The disaster at Stalingrad was unfolding. The Eastern Front was swallowing men, materiel, and morale at a rate the Reich could not sustain. At home, Allied bombing raids intensified, striking factories, railways, and entire city blocks. Intelligence reports predicted economic strains, growing dissent, and the potential for political cracks within occupied territories. The RSHA was not simply a police headquarters. It was the regime's nervous system, coordinating the Gestapo, the criminal police, Kripo, the Security Intelligence Service, SD, and sections responsible for foreign intelligence and ideological research. Through these branches, it monitored populations, identified enemies, orchestrated deportations, and enforced racial policy across the continent. With Heydrich gone, the question inside the SS was whether anyone could manage such a vast structure effectively. Kaltenbrunner stepped into the role with a different style than his predecessor. Heydrich had been charismatic, cunning, and visionary in his brutality. Kaltenbrunner was methodical, austere. He rarely relied on charm or persuasion. Instead, he depended on legalistic frameworks, bureaucratic discipline, and an unwavering belief in the racial doctrines that underpinned Nazi policy. Colleagues described him as cold, remote, and driven by the conviction that every detail, every file, every report, every interrogation summary served the greater ideological purpose. His appointment came at a moment when the RSHA was refining the processes of the final solution. Mass deportations to extermination centers were well underway. Command structures linking field police units to the central office had been strengthened during Heydrich's tenure, but they still required careful oversight. Himmler expected Kaltenbrunner to maintain coordination between the police, the SS, and civilian administrators across occupied Europe. He was not asked to innovate, he was asked to ensure nothing faltered. One of his earliest responsibilities involved integrating intelligence from the Eastern Front, where Einsatzgruppen and local auxiliary forces continued mass shootings and anti-partisan operations. The reports flowed into Berlin, detailing villages burned, communities erased, and security sweeps carried out under the guise of fighting resistance. The bureaucratic language often concealed the human reality, but for the RSHA leadership, the numbers were the point. They were statistics in a system designed to measure ideological success. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, new challenges were emerging. Resistance movements in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had grown more coordinated. Sabotage, targeted assassinations, and underground networks required constant surveillance. Kaltenbrunner's office authorized countermeasures, mass arrests, deportations, and intensified interrogation practices. The RSHA pushed for broader intelligence sharing with military commands, ensuring that civilian populations remained under constant pressure. Inside the German homeland, the situation was no less volatile. Allied bombing campaigns created displaced populations, disrupted logistics, and weakened internal security. The RSHA monitored morale, identified defeatist attitudes, and acted against anyone suspected of undermining the war effort. The networks of informants expanded, generating vast quantities of reports for analysis. Kaltenbrunner relied on these internal summaries to anticipate threats and to shape recommendations sent to Himmler. His influence extended beyond police operations. By mid-1943, he supervised administrative links to concentration camps through RSHA departments responsible for transportation, political prisoners, and security classification. Though the camps themselves were under SS Economic Administrative Main Office, WWII jurisdiction, the RSHA determined who was sent there, for what reason, and under which category. The pipeline into the camp system, from interrogation to deportation, flowed through Kaltenbrunner's world. This intersection of intelligence, policing, and racial policy placed the RSHA at the center of Germany's war against civilians. And by occupying Heydrich's former position, Kaltenbrunner became one of the most consequential figures in the regime's internal machinery. Yet his rise remained overshadowed by other high-ranking leaders. Himmler, Goebbels, Goering, and even technocrats like Speer dominated the public narrative. Kaltenbrunner worked in the shadows, a man whose influence was vast but deliberately concealed behind layers of bureaucracy. This obscurity was not accidental. The RSHA thrived in secrecy. Its power lay in invisibility, in the fear produced not by spectacle, but by the belief that its reach extended into every corner of daily life. And the man directing it embraced that logic. He cultivated anonymity as a strength, allowing the system to operate without drawing attention to his own hand. But even the most carefully concealed networks eventually faced their reckoning. As the war intensified and Germany's strategic position deteriorated, the RSHA's actions would become increasingly desperate and increasingly brutal. And it is within these pressures that the true angles of Kaltenbrunner's influence come into focus. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was not a figure shaped by battlefield glory or political charisma. His rise came through the quieter, more disciplined channels of bureaucratic power. Those who worked with him described a man of severe habits, punctual, restrained, deeply formal, and unwilling to reveal emotion even in private exchanges. His towering height and scarred face made him visually intimidating, but it was his rigid self-control that defined his presence. Unlike some Nazi leaders, he rarely indulged in flamboyant speeches or ideological theatrics. Instead, he communicated through memoranda, directives, and legal terminology, the clean language of administration that masked the violence it delivered. His background as a lawyer played a central role in shaping his mindset. He believed in order, in hierarchy, in procedures that reduced moral decisions to paperwork. This legalistic worldview allowed him to detach himself from the consequences of his actions. Where others embraced brutality openly, Kaltenbrunner elevated it to administrative routine. He was the embodiment of the bureaucratic perpetrator, the man who did not need to see the suffering he caused because he trusted the system he helped maintain. Inside the RSHA, he cultivated an image of unwavering discipline. Subordinates knew he expected reports filed on time, categorizations followed precisely, and personal opinions kept to a minimum. In his view, the machine of state security operated best when its operators remained invisible. And it was through this cultivated invisibility, this belief that duty superseded human judgment, that Kaltenbrunner became one of the most dangerous figures within the Nazi hierarchy. Kaltenbrunner's leadership of the RSHA lacked the improvisational brilliance of Heydrich, but it compensated with methodical consolidation. Where Heydrich had built the structure, Kaltenbrunner perfected its internal rigidity. He emphasized vertical control. Orders flowed downward with precision, while information flowed upward through tightly curated channels. He demanded exhaustive reporting, not because he doubted his subordinates, but because he believed the system must operate with total clarity. Every action documented, every target categorized, every threat assessed. His subordinates often felt the weight of his presence even when he wasn't physically in the room. He ruled through an atmosphere of professional fear, not open terror, but the fear of violating procedural expectations, failing to deliver the exact metrics, summaries, or legal verbiage he required. This environment rewarded those who adapted to institutional logic and punished those who hesitated or questioned. The RSHA was not a chaotic police force. It was a disciplined, hierarchical engine of state violence, and Kaltenbrunner kept it running through constant oversight. Importantly, he maintained close alignment with Himmler's overarching goals. He rarely opposed directives from above, choosing instead to interpret them with strict fidelity. Yet this obedience was not civility, it was strategic. By positioning himself as the perfect executor of higher policy, he avoided internal conflict and secured Himmler's trust. In a system fueled by competition and intrigue, Kaltenbrunner survived by making himself indispensable. His leadership style turned the RSHA into an institution that did not merely follow orders, it anticipated them. And that anticipation became one of the most lethal features of the Nazi security apparatus. Within the RSHA, Kaltenbrunner's primary strength lay in his understanding of how intelligence, policing, and ideology intersected. He viewed state security as a total environment where no distinction existed between political threats, ethnic groups, resistance movements, or criminal activity. All were processed under the same logic: classify, monitor, suppress. This approach gave the RSHA enormous flexibility. A political dissident could be labeled a criminal, a partisan sympathizer, or a racial enemy, whichever category justified removal with the least administrative friction. Kaltenbrunner reinforced and expanded systems of data collection. Interrogation summaries, surveillance notes, population reports, and captured documents were all funneled into a central analysis process designed to identify patterns and vulnerabilities. He believed intelligence was the backbone of security operations, and he pushed for increasingly exhaustive evaluations of occupied territories. In his view, resistance did not arise spontaneously, it grew from identifiable social structures. Break those structures through deportations, arrests, informants, or intimidation, and resistance could be strangled before it matured. Under his oversight, the RSHA refined coordination with regional commanders. Information flowed from Paris, Krakow, Oslo, and Prague into Berlin, where analysts processed it into recommendations for policy. This integration of field reports with central authority allowed the RSHA to act with frightening precision. When a crackdown occurred, it appeared instantaneous, as if the state had been watching every move, because, in many cases, it had. Kaltenbrunner did not need to be on the front lines to shape outcomes. His influence came from the office, the file cabinet, the chain of signatures. And through these channels, he shaped a security apparatus that operated with cold efficiency. The culmination of these angles becomes most visible when the system he controlled faced its greatest test, the turning points of the war. Kaltenbrunner's RSHA thrived not only on fear and discipline, but on the meticulous use of bureaucratic and technological tools. At a time when mass communication was limited, the office relied on a network of teleprinters, coded messages, and centralized filing systems to process information from across occupied Europe. Every report, arrest order, and transportation request passed through standardized forms, often annotated in precise ink, stamped with dates, and routed through multiple departments for verification. This machinery of paperwork was not merely administrative, it was a weapon. By converting human lives into files and statistics, Kaltenbrunner's office obscured the human cost of its operations. Transport manifests for deportations listed numbers, categories, and destinations, never the horrors that awaited the passengers. Surveillance logs recorded routines and behaviors of suspected resistors as if they were entries in a ledger. This technological rigor made atrocities reproducible and scalable. The RSHA's ability to coordinate actions across hundreds of cities, towns, and occupied territories relied on this precision. Without it, the speed and scale of Nazi repression would have been impossible. Moreover, the office's use of cryptography and coded dispatches allowed operations to proceed with a degree of secrecy unparalleled in contemporary bureaucracies. Messages moved from Berlin to Warsaw, Prague to Paris, without revealing intent to local populations or even to many military officials. Kaltenbrunner understood that control over information, who had it, who could read it, and how it was interpreted, was as vital as any weapon on the battlefield. In the hands of the RSHA, information became a force multiplier, allowing a relatively small number of officials to orchestrate terror on a continental scale. For the populations under RSHA jurisdiction, Kaltenbrunner's influence was palpable and immediate. Jewish families in Vienna, Warsaw, and Amsterdam learned to dread the knock on the door, the summons, the lists of names sent for deportation. Partisans, underground networks, and political dissidents operated under constant threat of infiltration. Rumors of informants. Surveillance and reprisals spread fear even where the RSHA did not act directly. The office's reach extended into every village, factory, and neighborhood, turning ordinary life into a landscape of suspicion. Resistance movements often saw the RSHA as omnipresent, anticipating their movements and countering their efforts before they could gain momentum. The psychological weight of this surveillance shaped the behavior of both individuals and communities. In occupied Europe, the RSHA's coordination meant that even small acts of defiance carried enormous risk. Families hid, rationed, and negotiated survival against a backdrop of precise and relentless bureaucracy. Kaltenbrunner's hand was invisible, but felt in every calculated arrest, every transport order, every interrogator's report. Kaltenbrunner represents a particular kind of moral danger, the banality of evil transformed into bureaucratic efficiency. He did not wield the sword, he wielded the signature. By codifying mass murder into memos, directives, and statistical charts, he created a system where obedience replaced conscience. The RSHA under him exemplified how ideology, discipline, and administration could intersect to perpetrate crimes on a staggering scale. Decisions that destroyed communities were made behind desks, approved by stamps, and justified through legalistic language. This moral lens underscores the profound human cost of a system designed to normalize atrocity. Kaltenbrunner's personal detachment, combined with his bureaucratic skill, made him a conduit through which ideological murder became routine. Unlike soldiers on a battlefield, victims of his system rarely encountered him directly, yet his authority shaped every step of their persecution. His career illuminates how ordinary administrative structures, when infused with lethal ideology, can become instruments of unparalleled destruction. Each of these angles, human, tactical, technological, enemy, moral, converges in the RSHA's operations during the critical turning points of the war, when Kaltenbrunner's decisions would intersect with both victory and collapse. By mid-1943, the war had reached a precarious tipping point for Germany. The Red Army was beginning to recover from Stalingrad, the Allies were consolidating gains in North Africa, and resistance networks in occupied Europe were growing bolder. Within this shifting landscape, Ernst Kaltenbrunner oversaw an RSHA tasked with maintaining control, enforcing ideology, and executing mass deportations with precision. His influence was absolute, yet the pressures mounting on him, from the front lines, from Himmler, and from the failing logistics of war, would push the machinery of terror to its limits. One of the first challenges he confronted was the continuation of deportations from Hungary, the last major Jewish population still partially untouched by the final solution. Beginning in March 1944, following German occupation of Hungary, Kaltenbrunner coordinated intelligence reports, transport schedules, and Gestapo instructions that enabled the rapid deportation of hundreds of thousands to Auschwitz-Birkenau. In his office, memos recorded exact numbers of trains, assembly points, and SS personnel required bureaucratic precision, masking the human catastrophe. Within weeks, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were transporting, many directly to gas chambers, a scale and speed unprecedented even in Nazi deportation efforts. Meanwhile, partisan activity in Eastern Europe increased. Soviet and local resistance forces attacked rail lines, communication hubs, and German supply depots. Kaltenbrunner's RSHA responded with sweeping security operations that combined Gestapo arrests, SD intelligence sweeps, and Einsatzgruppen oversight. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were surrounded, inhabitants interrogated, and suspected sympathizers deported or executed. Reports of these operations flowed back to Berlin, detailing both successes in neutralizing resistance and the growing strain on personnel and infrastructure. The system Kaltenbrunner oversaw was efficient, but it was also showing signs of overextension. On the Western Front, the build-up to D-Day in mid-1944 created unprecedented internal pressure. German intelligence feared Allied sabotage, infiltration, and espionage. Kaltenbrunner authorized intensified surveillance in France, the Low Countries, and Italy. He demanded increased use of informants, harsher interrogations, and stricter control over civilians in occupied areas. Entire regions were subjected to curfews, mandatory registrations, and random searches. The objective was clear: maintain the illusion of omnipresence, to project order even as military defeat loomed. Simultaneously, Kaltenbrunner had to navigate the internal dynamics of the SS and Nazi bureaucracy. Himmler's trust was conditional. Any misstep, any perceived inefficiency, risked replacement by a rival eager for power. The RSHA's operations, therefore, were as much about demonstrating loyalty to Himmler as they were about executing policy. Orders for deportations, executions, or interrogations were meticulously documented, creating a paper trail that proved obedience even as the war situation deteriorated. In these months, the RSHA's mechanized brutality reached a climax. In Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, systematic massacres and deportations were conducted with unprecedented coordination. Kaltenbrunner's hand was everywhere, though rarely visible to those on the ground. He ensured that each action aligned with ideological priorities, logistical constraints, and Himmler's directives. Resistance was crushed not only through force, but through the very structure he had perfected, the combination of intelligence, bureaucracy, and fear. Yet cracks were forming. Supply lines faltered. SS units became overstretched. Intelligence reports highlighted not only enemy activity, but also the growing resentment of local populations, who increasingly avoided detection and undermined German operations. Even within the RSHA, the human toll was evident: overstressed officers, clerks processing endless deportation lists, and the moral disengagement required to maintain efficiency. The very system Kaltenbrunner had refined now showed its vulnerability under the weight of the war's escalating demands. It was in this high-stakes environment that the final year of the war would test both Kaltenbrunner and the institution he commanded. Decisions taken in Berlin, Vienna, Warsaw, and Prague over these months would not only determine the operational effectiveness of the RSHA, but also seal the fate of millions under its reach, and eventually bring the architect of its machinery to his reckoning. By late 1944, Germany's position on both fronts had become increasingly precarious. The Soviet advance from the east, the Allied liberation of France, and the strategic bombing campaign over the Reich signaled that the war was approaching a catastrophic collapse. For Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the RSHA faced the dual pressure of maintaining operational control while confronting an unraveling logistical and ideological framework. In October 1944, Himmler issued orders for the evacuation of concentration camp prisoners in the east. The RSHA, under Kaltenbrunner's direct supervision, coordinated the forced marches, later termed death marches, from Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and other camps threatened by the approaching Red Army. Thousands perished in the bitter cold, often without food, water, or medical care. Documentation was maintained meticulously: dates, numbers, routes, and personnel assignments, reflecting Kaltenbrunner's commitment to procedural efficiency even amidst moral collapse. His office viewed these evacuations not as humanitarian crises, but as a continuation of the systematic approach to state security. Simultaneously, resistance and partisan activity intensified across occupied Europe. In the Netherlands, France, and the Balkans, sabotage disrupted rail lines and supply chains critical to deportations and military logistics. The RSHA's response was uncompromising. Mass arrests, executions, and reprisals were ordered with precise coordination. Kaltenbrunner's directives emphasized speed and documentation. Orders carried time stamps, signatures, and cross-references to ensure accountability within the bureaucratic hierarchy, leaving little room for local discretion. As the Allied forces approached Germany itself, the RSHA faced internal disintegration. Regional commanders acted increasingly autonomously, communication lines were disrupted by bombings and partisan attacks, and morale among SS personnel plummeted. Kaltenbrunner attempted to maintain control through detailed reports, centralized command protocols, and intensified surveillance, but the very complexity that had made the RSHA effective now made it rigid and vulnerable. The collapse culminated in April 1945. Soviet troops entered Vienna, and Kaltenbrunner attempted to evade capture, moving between safe houses while coordinating the final remnants of RSHA operations. By early May, Germany's surrender was imminent. Kaltenbrunner was apprehended by U.S. forces near Salzburg. Documents found in his possession detailed extensive records of deportations, executions, and security operations, the bureaucratic fingerprints of crimes against humanity. The arrest marked the final turning point. The shadowy architect of Nazi terror was no longer in command. For the first time, the meticulous records, reports, and signatures that had allowed Kaltenbrunner to direct mass murder became evidence against him. Every form, memo, and transport list was a testament to his central role in the machinery of the Third Reich. These documents, coupled with witness testimonies and captured correspondence, would form the backbone of the case presented against him at the Nuremberg trials. The intersection of ideology, bureaucratic discipline, and wartime crisis had created both the zenith and the unraveling of Kaltenbrunner's power. What had allowed him to operate with ruthless efficiency for years now became the evidence that ensured accountability. The world had witnessed the system in action, and the consequences would be recorded in history, law, and memory. This moment leads directly into the aftermath, the legal reckoning, the trial, and the final assessment of a man whose life had been defined by the orchestration of terror. The capture of Ernst Kaltenbrunner in May 1945 marked the beginning of a process that would expose the full extent of his crimes. Once a figure hidden behind the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich, he now stood at the center of international scrutiny. Transferred to Nuremberg for trial before the International Military Tribunal, he was assigned prison quarters under constant guard. Unlike some of his co-defendants, he did not protest loudly. His demeanor remained austere, almost detached, yet the weight of his responsibility was unavoidable. The charges against him were severe: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in organizations deemed criminal by the tribunal, including the SS and Gestapo. The prosecution focused on his tenure as chief of the RSHA from January 1943, highlighting his role in orchestrating deportations, executions, and the suppression of resistance. Evidence was extensive. Documents seized from RSHA offices, transport lists, correspondence with regional commanders, and internal memoranda illustrated his direct oversight of the final solution and other atrocities. Witness testimony reinforced the documentary record. Survivors from occupied territories, former prisoners, and even lower-ranking SS officers described the chain of command, confirming that Kaltenbrunner's authority was decisive in decisions affecting the lives and deaths of millions. One key witness, an SS adjutant, detailed the daily routines of RSHA administration, emphasizing how orders passed from Kaltenbrunner's desk to field units, leaving no ambiguity about his responsibility. Another former camp administrator corroborated his involvement in deportation directives from Vienna and Berlin, including logistical coordination for trains bound for Auschwitz. The tribunal meticulously reconstructed the operations under his control. Each deportation schedule, execution report, and operational order was scrutinized, revealing the systematic nature of his administration. The RSHA was not a series of isolated acts of violence. It was a coordinated network whose center of gravity rested on Kaltenbrunner's leadership. His legal training, previously a tool for efficiency, now served as evidence of deliberate, conscious orchestration of crimes. Beyond documentation, the psychological dimension of his culpability was undeniable. Kaltenbrunner had risen through the Nazi system not by battlefield heroics or propaganda, but by bureaucratic skill and ruthless obedience to ideology. His trial highlighted how administrative expertise, when combined with moral disengagement, could facilitate atrocities on an unprecedented scale. This principle would become a defining theme of post-war analysis: the banality of evil, embodied in a man who orchestrated mass murder with pens, files, and orders, rather than on the battlefield. As the tribunal proceeded, the case against him crystallized. The records, coupled with testimony, painted a portrait of a man whose meticulous adherence to Nazi policy allowed genocide to function with horrifying efficiency. The evidence was overwhelming. The stage was set for judgment, which would not only determine his fate, but also set legal and moral precedents for the accountability of bureaucrats and administrators in systems of mass violence. The trial would soon reach its culmination, revealing not only Kaltenbrunner's personal fate, but the consequences for the institutions he had directed. On September 15, 1946, the International Military Tribunal delivered its verdict. Ernst Kaltenbrunner was found guilty on multiple counts: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in criminal organizations, including the SS and Gestapo. The judgment emphasized his central role in the administration of the RSHA and the execution of policies that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians, prisoners, and resistance members across Europe. The tribunal noted that his bureaucratic skill, far from mitigating responsibility, had magnified the scale of atrocities by ensuring that each directive was efficiently implemented. The sentence was death by hanging, scheduled for October 16, 1946. In the final weeks, Kaltenbrunner remained composed, reportedly reflecting little outwardly on his actions. Prison records describe him as disciplined and uncommunicative, maintaining the same austere demeanor that had marked his rise within the SS. In this quiet, constrained environment, the man who had orchestrated mass murder from the shadows now awaited his reckoning, a stark inversion of the power he had wielded with such precision. On the morning of his execution, Kaltenbrunner's presence in the dock underscored the tribunal's larger message. No bureaucratic skill, no matter how disciplined or remote, could shield one from accountability. His execution followed a carefully documented procedure, witnessed by military officials and legal observers, ensuring that justice was carried out publicly, if not theatrically. In the hours and minutes leading up to it, the culmination of years of investigation, testimony, and evidence reached its final, irrevocable point. The legal and historical legacy of Kaltenbrunner's trial extended far beyond the verdict. The meticulous records of RSHA operations presented at Nuremberg established an unprecedented standard. Bureaucratic efficiency, when combined with ideological commitment to systematic mass murder, constituted a punishable offense under international law. Scholars and legal analysts have repeatedly cited his case as a benchmark for understanding how administrators and technocrats can participate in crimes of extraordinary magnitude, even without direct participation in physical violence. Contemporary archives, including captured RSHA files and correspondence, continue to provide insight into both the mechanics of Nazi terror and Kaltenbrunner's personal methods. They reveal a chilling precision. Each deportation, execution, and surveillance report carefully documented, signed, and routed through multiple layers of oversight. These materials serve not only as evidence of guilt, but also as a study in the operational mindset of a bureaucrat whose loyalty to ideology superseded any moral restraint. Post-war analyses, memoirs of survivors, and tribunal records converge on a singular conclusion. Kaltenbrunner was both a product and an instrument of the Nazi state. His rise demonstrated the lethal potential of administrative expertise, while his fall illustrated the inescapable consequences when such expertise is wielded for evil. The human cost, millions of lives erased, communities destroyed, and fear institutionalized, remains inseparable from his legacy. And yet, beyond legal judgment, historians and ethicists have sought to understand what his story teaches about humanity, bureaucracy, and the structures of power, lessons that resonate far beyond the walls of Nuremberg. Ernst Kaltenbrunner's life and career reveal a stark truth. Evil can operate quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly through the instruments of bureaucracy. He did not fight on battlefields, rally crowds, or lead armies. Yet through the power of documents, orders, and administrative precision, he became a central architect of terror. The RSHA under his command exemplified how ideology, discipline, and organizational skill can combine to produce systematic, mechanized atrocity. Kaltenbrunner's rise illustrates the vulnerability of societies when legal and administrative structures are captured by uncompromising ideology. His actions were not impulsive acts of passion or wartime chaos. They were deliberate, codified, and executed with precision. The very qualities often praised in civil service, loyalty, diligence, attention to detail, became instruments of mass murder when divorced from ethical restraint. It is this inversion of normal human faculties that makes his story both fascinating and terrifying. The trial and execution of Kaltenbrunner at Nuremberg offered more than retribution. It codified the principle that individuals, regardless of rank or bureaucratic role, are accountable for crimes against humanity. His case set a precedent for understanding how structures of power, when misused, can multiply human suffering far beyond what a single person might inflict physically. It is a reminder that the machinery of governance, legal, technological, or administrative, carries moral weight, and that the banality of evil is often disguised in the language of procedure. Today, the shadow of Kaltenbrunner's influence persists in history books, archives, and memorials. The meticulous records he kept, intended to enforce terror, now preserve memory and bear witness. They compel us to confront the consequences of bureaucratic obedience without conscience and to consider how systems can be designed to prevent such concentration of power again. In the end, Kaltenbrunner's story is not only a chronicle of atrocity, but a cautionary reflection on humanity. It challenges us to recognize that the tools of civilization, law, administration, and order can serve either justice or destruction. How they are wielded, and by whom, defines the moral contour of history. The shadow of his legacy lingers, silent yet instructive, urging vigilance and the continual examination of power, responsibility, and conscience.